Hey folks, welcome back to History Chat at 1 o'clock on Thursdays, where we're talking today about the history of the Republican Party, moving the story forward from the era of the New Deal, which was a period of real problem for the Republicans who couldn't manage to articulate a new political vision for the country after the rise of the Democrats and the New Deal. And now I want to push that into how the Republicans, in fact, did come up with a new vision. But I want to step back a little bit first and mention that I'm going to be talking a lot today about Dwight Eisenhower. And I find him an absolutely fascinating character because if you think about Eisenhower, um, he's kind of, at least in the last many decades, he's kind of been treated in popular culture as if he's kind of like an Elmer Fudd character. And Elmer Fudd, if you're not aware, is like a Looney Tunes sort of stupid old backwoods guy. And it's interesting to me because having read political history and politicians now for close to 40 years, I'll tell you, Eisenhower's brilliant. And he was, of course, the leader of the Allied Expeditionary Force in World War II, which essentially means that he was responsible in large part for winning World War II. And then he went on to be the president of Columbia University, which is, I'll explain why that's important. And then he became extremely popular two-term president. And I find it fascinating that today's GOP does not put him in their pantheon of heroes. And the fact that they are lionizing Confederate generals right now instead of people like Eisenhower is a really interesting statement about where the party is today. Because again, think about it. If you had on your political team the guy who, I don't know, won World War II, wouldn't he be front and center in every campaign even still, the same way, in a way that the GOP relied on Lincoln forever and a day? And the fact that they don't rely on Eisenhower, that Eisenhower is almost a forgotten character. And again, you could see why a party would want to forget Benjamin Harrison, because really, frankly, what does he have going for him? Even though they downplay the Wounded Knee Massacre, for example, which happened on his watch. But Eisenhower, why isn't Eisenhower front and center? And that question of why Eisenhower is not really speaking to the modern day Republican Party is going to play out over the next several weeks. So, okay, let me go back then and start with where we were in 1948, because I left you with the idea of on the one hand, you have the Taft Republicans led by Ohio Senator Robert Taft, who is the son of President Taft, William Howard Taft. And he believes that the New Deal and what has happened under the Democrats under World War II is a mistake. He believes that the country really needs to go back to the plans of Hoover in the 1920s. And Taft he worked for Hoover. He believes that this whole New Deal thing needs to be erased, and you need to go back to that. And so after World War II and after the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt on April 12th, 1945, Taft really thinks that the world is ready to erase that bad period and go back to the 1920s, which in the minds of people like him and Hoover were just ducky. I mean, and actually that's a word from the 20s, believe it or not. I learned that from my dad. He grew up in the 20s. That really that there might have been some mistakes, but really it was terribly dangerous to try and regulate business with the government and provide a basic social safety net and promote infrastructure. This was all very dangerous. So they expected, the Taft Republicans really, truly expected that they would regain power after World War II. And when the Republican Party passes over Taft and nominates Dewey in 1948, Dewey being a Republican from New York who understands that there has to be some kind of basic social safety net and understands that there has to be government regulation. First of all, Taft is hurt when they pass over him for that nomination. But when Dewey loses to Truman, again, that famous newspaper article, Dewey defeats Truman, but in fact, that didn't happen. Truman defeated Dewey. Taft really goes ballistic. And mind you, these are much more casual than I would write in my letters. That's you could hedge that a lot. What is it? I'm sorry, I'm not going to go into. I'm doing these much more casually. So when I say Taft went ballistic, recognize that's colloquial. I'm not actually taking a stand on his temperament when I say that. All right, so, but it's just more interesting if you make these people. Anyway, he goes ballistic. And he says the problem with 48 was that the Republicans ran as a Me Too party. That is, the Democrats have created this new kind of government, and the Republicans have just sort of tagged along behind, going Me Too, Me Too, Me Too. And the American people doesn't want that, or don't want that. That if given the choice between the FDR version and the Republican version, of course they're going to go for the Democratic version. So he believes that the Republican Party has to cut loose the Dewey Republicans and go back to the world before the New Deal. So this is 48, and he really expects that. And in 1949, he gets a real boost because communism, the Communist Party takes over China in 49. And when that happens, since World War II, the expansion of communism around Europe and Asia has really alarmed Americans. And when China also becomes a communist country, this is a really, really, really big deal. And this is one of the ways we're going to get, and I'll tell you more about this in the future, the rise of the John Birch Society, which is referring to, it has its roots in the idea of Chinese communism taking over the country, but crucially also being aided by people in the United States government. Because for a lot of Americans, they looked at the spread of communism and went, what the heck just happened here? We just won this world war, and we're supposed to be sitting on top of the world. And communism seems to be winning. It's taking over all these satellite countries around the USSR. And it is now taking over China. So what's going on? They must be being helped by the American government. Now, again, I'm going to give you a little aside here. One of the things that I'm playing with now that has nothing to do with the Republican book I'm talking about here, but it's really interesting to me that when we talk about this period in American history, really from World War II on, we focus really strongly on anti-communism. But what we have sort of read out of our history is that there are a lot of people who are anti-fascist in this period. There is an anti-fascist movement as well, which makes complete sense, of course, because in World War II, America had been fighting against fascism. And you still had the threat of fascist governments in Europe, especially. So it's interesting, again, to me as a historian that, and I only know this because when we started hearing about Antifa, I'm like, what the heck is that going on about? And I actually looked back into our history. And in fact, we do have a history of standing against fascism since World War II, not just in World War II. And that's really kind of been erased from our history as we became this anti-communist country, and how that happened and why that happened is really intimately tied up in the material that I'll deal with next week. But Eisenhower saw the problems of what he called the military-industrial complex, although I don't think I'm going to talk to you about it today. All right, so by the way, I just saw somebody saying that people are listening and watching the John Lewis funeral. I'm recorded. Go watch the Lewis funeral. That's history in the making. Really. I promise that what I'm going to talk about happened more than 50 years ago. You can come back to this, but seeing Lewis, and by the way, if you have not read his op-ed in the New York Times today, that's the other thing you should be doing instead of watching me. Anyway, all right. So let's go back to what's happening in America in 1949. So in 1949, you have again this fear that America is somehow, that the people in government are somehow supporting or feeding or accepting or working for communism. And that ties in really tightly to the idea of people who had opposed the New Deal and really loathed Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that somehow America is going to be taken over by communists, or in fact that they actually are being taken over by communists. So what happens is after the 1948 election, in that election, of course, Truman is reelected and Congress goes Democratic again. So Republicans instantly go, look, communism is spreading into across the world, it's spreading into China, And now it's the Democrats have taken back over Congress. Look, they must be communists too. And you know exactly where this is going. On February 9th in 1950, the junior senator from Wisconsin, Senator Joe McCarthy, and he's really unremarkable. McCarthy is in this era. He's actually looking for some topic on which to run for re-election because he's not been popular. He hasn't done very much, and he needs an issue. And again, a little bit of an aside here. There are two ways really to garner power in Congress, and one is by actually creating coalitions and passing legislation. And the other is really kind of more to be a burr under the saddle, to get popular support behind you so that if people turn on you in Congress, you can go running out to your people and say, oh, look, they're being mean to me, or, you know, I'm not getting attention or whatever. And you can see this really distinctly in the way people behave in Congress. Are they kind of, you know, I hate to say a backroom dealer, but are they the people pulling together coalitions and getting crap done? Or are they the sort of people on the outside who are making a splash in the popular media? And that's actually something to be aware of when you're voting. Is your congressperson actually delivering or for you and for things you care about, or is your congressperson just talking a lot? You might want someone who just talks a lot. Charles Sumner in the 1850s just talked a lot, but of course he became, you know, a star in the pantheon of Massachusetts heroes. Or is he, if you will, John Quincy Adams, who, when he went back into the House of Representatives after being president, every single Monday hammered on the idea that Southern slaveholders were not permitting Americans to petition their government. That was the gag, the petition gag that that John Quincy Adams kept hammering on, and that actually got something done. Charles Sumner, maybe not so much. He's a symbol, but that motivates a lot of people. John Quincy Adams actually got stuff done. So here's a case where Joe McCarthy is actually, you know, he's not getting stuff done, and he's a kind of a, you know, he's an operator. He needs something to run on. He's coming up for re-election. He needs something to run on. So on February 9th of 1950, he's gotten kind of low-level speaking gigs because, you know, he's a junior senator. If you can get, and he's not very famous, if you could get somebody high profile, you'd much rather have them. So he's the guy who goes off to give a talk to a women's group in Wheeling, West Virginia, in honor of Lincoln's birthday, to give a speech on Lincoln's birthday. And what he does there is he actually stands up and he waves a piece of paper, and he says there are 205 members of the Communist Party working in the United States State Department, and that they are shaping national policy, and that the Democratic Secretary of State knew it and wasn't doing anything about it. And then he goes on, he says, I don't have the time to tell you who these people are, but the Truman administration is refusing to investigate, and these people are traitors. They're traitors in government. Well, it's really interesting because when I actually did the research to look into what that was actually on that piece of paper, a lot of textbooks will say we didn't have proof that he said that. And I don't know why they say that, because it's reprinted across the country in all the newspapers the day after. And he never says he didn't say it. So I'm not entirely sure where that, we're not sure he came up with 205 names. That's what's in the newspapers. So I don't know where that came from, because he's going to change that number again and again and again. But initially said 205 names. All right. So the Chicago Tribune, which I mentioned before, is a really staunchly anti-communist newspaper, really strongly Republican. The history of the Chicago Tribune is fascinating. And now I'm in the 1950s. In the 1950s, it's part of a consortium of newspapers, or rather the person who owns it owns a number of other newspapers. So when I talk about the Chicago Tribune, you can know that this information is being broadcast more widely. So it's a really strongly pro-Republican and pro-Joe McCarthy newspaper. So it picks up this story, and it trumpets it in all of its newspapers. And the next day, I mean, McCarthy knows how key it is to run with the media. He's very media savvy, and he pledges that he will share the names of, and this is a quote, 57 card-carrying communists, unquote, in the State Department. And he says he will share them with the Secretary of State, a guy named Dean Acheson, so long as the Secretary would let Congress investigate the loyalty records of all the people in the government departments. Well, this is like a huge overreach. I mean, for the executive department to say that it's going to go investigate Congress has a bad word. The Constitution gives Congress the right to investigate the executive branch. So this was just McCarthy really thumbing his nose at the Democrats in the executive branch. Well, Acheson goes nuts. He had been instrumental in putting together the Marshall Plan, in which America put money into Europe after World War II, in part to rebuild European countries and to make them less susceptible to communist, to turning to communism, but also in part to create markets. If you know about the Marshall Scholarship, that's still, universities still give the Marshall Scholarship in Europe still pays for the Marshall Scholarship in thanks for the Marshall Plan. That's where that came from. But it was also in part for America to develop markets in Europe, because Europe was devastated. They needed to rebuild the economy in order to have markets again for American goods. Anyway, so Acheson had helped with the Marshall Plan, and he had also worked to establish NATO. And NATO was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is an organization by which a number of European countries, including plus Turkey, worked to hold back the aggression of the USSR, the expanding USSR in Europe, especially Europe. The North Atlantic is called Treaty Organization, especially Europe after World War II. And I'm going to talk more about NATO today, but it's worth mentioning perhaps, although I am trying to keep these largely historical, that this is why people are going ballistic over Trump's removal of 12,500 American troops from Germany, is because that dramatically weakens NATO. And NATO went from standing against the USSR to standing against Russia, Vladimir Putin's Russia, when Putin took over Russia and put an oligarchy in place after the collapse of the independence movements in the USSR after the fall of USSR in that region. So to pull, I mean, this is an absolute attack on NATO, which has been holding Europe together since 1945, or not 40, it doesn't start in 45, since shortly after 1945. All right, so Acheson has been instrumental in putting together NATO, and Taft hates these. Robert Taft, the guy who leads that group of Republicans who want to go back to the 1920s, hates NATO, because he really thinks it's a waste of time to focus on Europe. He wants to focus on Asia. The Republicans in the Taft mold really don't want to focus on Europe at all. They want to go into Asia because they have economic interests in Asia, and they believe that expanding into Asia is the real future of the American economy. So they see Europe as a real sideshow, if you will. And you'll remember I mentioned the other day that they saw the bombing of Pearl Harbor that's why they accused FDR of knowing about that, as they thought it was a backdoor way to involve America in Europe when they thought that was a waste of time. And that, as I say, became part of the American lexicon, that FDR knew about the bombing of Pearl Harbor, knew it was coming. He did not. There was high alert on all the bases in that region, but he didn't know when it was coming or where. That's a slur on the part of the Taft Republicans. All right, so they hate NATO. They hate NATO. They hate the Marshall Plan. They don't want to be in Europe. They want to be in Asia if they're anywhere. And what happens then is that Acheson comes back at McCarthy and says, you know, you're expletive insane. Again, I'm not quoting here. You have no proof of any of this. You show us some evidence of what you're talking about, and of course we're going to take a look at who's in our ranks. But we don't have any communists over here. You know, we can't prove a negative. And when that happened, McCarthy actually telegraphed Truman himself, saying that Truman was protecting communists in government. And the Chicago Tribune splashes it across the front page. McCarthy actually wrote to Truman saying, quote, "Failure on your part will label the Democratic Party as being the bedfellow of international communism." Well, the State Department comes out and says, "Give us any evidence. Come on, show us what you've got." And most of the other newspapers in the country are like, they call this sewer politics. They say there's no evidence for it, and that they're simply trying to undermine the Democratic State Department. But McCarthy does something really important, and that's that he has perfected the art of manipulating a media that focuses on being impartial. So if in fact the media is trying simply to present the facts, which is what the American media tries to do after the 1890s and what happens in the 1890s, which I talked a little bit about here, maybe someday I'll talk about more, but the polarization of media in the 1890s essentially gets us into a war and causes a lot of trouble in the country. So the American media tried to become independent in the late 19th and early 20th century, but the problem with becoming without actually evaluating anything, was simply presenting stuff, is it enables people who are willing to straight up lie to get much more traction than they ought to, because in fact, for a sitting U.S. senator to accuse the American president of treason is news. By any standard, it's news. But because those newspapers didn't have some mechanism in place to say he is lying, what that did is it created the impression that in fact what McCarthy was saying was true. So he would make these extraordinary accusations against Truman, against Democrats, against anybody he was mad at. And they would show up in the newspapers as news because they were news, but there was no pushback on them. So by the time the reporters ran along behind them and went, wait a minute, there isn't evidence of this. This didn't happen. That was not news. That was fact checking. And so that ended up, on page 4 or page 12 or whatever of the newspaper. And McCarthy moved on to something else. And this was a system of sort of being one lie ahead of the fact checking that worked incredibly well for McCarthy. And you can see other leaders who have done the same thing, manipulating the media to have it produce facts and news, but to make that news grab the headlines without actually being true. And by the time it's fact checked, it's too late. As Mark Twain said, a lie travels 12 times around the room while the truth is still putting its shoes on. McCarthy's the guy who invents that system. I mean, probably not invents it. It's certainly, we've been having this kind of manipulation probably since people first started talking. But in the modern era, McCarthy really perfected this to the point that shortly, not a journalist, the guy who makes a cartoonist for the Washington Post, a guy named Herb Block, is going to call this sort of hit and run destruction of people's lives McCarthyism. And that's where we get the term McCarthyism. All right. Taft, who is the head of the Republican Party at this period, could have shut McCarthy down, and he doesn't. He loves it because it's actually gaining traction, and it looks like it's going to really badly hurt the Democrats, especially in the midterm elections of 1950, and he's all for it if that's the case. He and newspapers like the Chicago Tribune really hammer again and again and again on McCarthy's accusations. And I have to do a little bit of an aside here. This is why Margaret Chase Smith of Maine first really vaults into prominence. And Margaret Chase Smith was a senator, and she actually stood up on the floor of Congress on June 1st of 1950. And he's sitting behind her and just bullying. That's what he does. And she stands up. She's a small woman, and she stands, but used to dealing with bullies, I have to say. And she stands up and she delivered what was called her Declaration of Conscience. And she stood up and she said, I speak as a Republican, I speak as a woman, I speak as a United States Senator, I speak as an American. And she said, listen, I want to win the upcoming midterm elections as much as any Republican, but we cannot see the Republican Party, and this is a quote, ride to political victory on the 4 horsemen of calumny. I just have trouble saying that. We cannot see the Republican Party ride to political victory on the 4 horsemen of calumny: fear, ignorance, bigotry, and sneer. As a Republican, as an American, she said, I condemn a Republican fascist just as much as I condemn a Democrat communist. They are equally dangerous to you and me and to our country. Now, what's interesting about that is that the Dewey Republicans wrote to her and said, this is just the best thing since sliced bread. Nobody stood up for her, or many of them didn't. Only 6 other Republican senators joined in her declaration, which then enabled McCarthy to sneer at them as Snow White and the 6 Dwarves. But it was a really powerful moment, and you will see I often write little things about Margaret Chase Smith because well, she had a conscience. You don't have to share her politics necessarily to be impressed with her willingness to take on McCarthy when nobody else was. So McCarthy is like, I don't care about you guys. I don't care about you Dewey Republicans. Us Taft guys are going to win in 1950. And in fact, they do. They do extremely well. In 50, Taft is reelected on a McCarthy platform to be senator again. And there's a sense that the Republican Party is going to move away from that old Me Too Dewey Republicanism and move back into recovering the 1920s under Taft. And so in 1952, Taft fully expects that he is going to go ahead and be nominated for the Republican presidency. But something else has happened. And that something else is that after the expansion of communism into China, China pushes into Korea in June of 1950. So shortly after Margaret Chase Smith stands up and does her declaration of conscience, the communist North Korea, which is backed by the USSR, pushes into non-communist South Korea in June of 1950, and the United States sends troops in to stop that advance, but they are very concerned that while Korea is going on over there on the Korean Peninsula, while the Korean War is going on, it's never a war, by the way, it's a police action, but while that goes on the Korean Peninsula, what American leaders are very worried about is that it's a distraction, that it's an attempt of the USSR to distract America in Korea, while in fact the USSR pushes into Europe. And so they are desperate to strengthen NATO, and NATO basically only exists on paper when Korea breaks out. And so actually American officials send Eisenhower over to Europe to take a look at what's happening with NATO, and he comes back and he's like, crap, we got nothing over here. Again, I paraphrase. And he's like, we desperately need to strengthen NATO or we're going to lose Europe to communism as well. But and he goes to Taft and he's like, you've got to get behind NATO, because Taft has been saying, I don't want any part of NATO. So you've got to get behind NATO. And Taft is like, screw you. Taft is like, no, I won't do that. We need to remove America from Europe altogether and focus instead on Asia, rather than focusing on Europe. And so he says, no, I won't back NATO. So going into the 1952 election, Eisenhower is looking at what he is afraid is going to be the collapse of Europe, and the fact that the front runner for the Republican nomination is saying, I don't care. And he's like, okay, I'm going to run for president. And this is how Eisenhower throws his hat in the ring to run for president in 1952. And it's an interesting decision on his part because Eisenhower was not a terribly political man. In fact, both parties had tried to get him to run as their president in 1948, and he had declined on both sides because he believed, of course, as a military leader, he should not get involved in politics on one side or the other. And by the way, in case I forget to say this in the future, you will notice if you see him that Eisenhower never wore his military uniform once he declared that he was running for a civilian office, and he never saluted the troops because he was a civilian. And that line between the military and civilian control of the military was something that presidents have taken extremely seriously until recently, and nobody illustrates that more effectively than Eisenhower. But Eisenhower, as I say, and I just want to do a little bit of a caveat here, I'm going to portray Eisenhower in a really positive light because I'm taking a look today at ideologies of the Republican Party. But my friend Randall, I'm not going to give his name because sometimes that brings more attention than people want. But I have a friend who is a scholar of African American history. And he always says to me, Heather, stop with the Eisenhower crap. Eisenhower wasn't so great for African Americans and women and minorities in this country. And that's true. And Eisenhower certainly screwed up in a lot of ways. We're still paying for what happened in Iran, but I actually want to give a positive view of him today, largely because I believe he's a positive leader, but also because it's a nice counterpoint to the accusations you hear, say, of him being Elmer Fudd, because he's actually incredibly smart. I mean, I've read his letters, I've read his books. He wrote his own books. He was an active, anyway, I'll stop on that, but I'm going to give you a positive view of him. All right. So Eisenhower is an interesting character because he actually goes to West Point for his education. And it's a really interesting thing because he almost loses his leg when he's growing up because he gets his knee scratched. And of course, before World War II, we don't have penicillin or any kind of drug like that. And the cut on his knee gets infected. And the doctor says he needs to take off Eisenhower's leg, and he's a kid. And Eisenhower says, "Don't do it, because all I got in my life is playing football. I want to take my chances and see if the leg will heal." And it does. If they had cut off Eisenhower's leg, he would not have been able to go to West Point, where he went to play football. And he would obviously have not gone on to become the trained leader that he was, and he would not have gone on to be available to direct the American and Allied response in World War II. And that's one of those, nail, horseshoe kind of things that just fascinates me. Another aside, Eisenhower played football for West Point. And West Point used to have a tradition, along with the Carlisle Indian School, that once a year the Indian School would play West Point. So you literally had the Indians and the soldiers playing football against each other. And Eisenhower actually played a football game on a team against Jim Thorpe, which is who's one of the great American athletes of all time. He was an indigenous person. And I just find it fascinating. And as I keep saying, there's only really 6 people in the world, and they do the rest with mirrors. The idea that Eisenhower played against Jim Thorpe is like crazy. All right. So anyway, so Eisenhower goes and plays football at West Point. He's very smart, and they recognize that he has a real executive ability. So they train him really to be kind of a paper pusher. And in World War I, he's responsible for the tank corps to try and move that. And it's a big issue that he doesn't get to go fight in Europe. He's unhappy about that. Of course, you go where you're told. He wanted to go fight. And in World War II, when he gets put in as the Supreme Allied Commander, there's a lot of carping behind him and people going like, yeah, the guy's a desk jockey. But obviously, he knew what he was doing. Crucially as well, in 1919, after the war, the Army does a convoy across America to sort of show their new technology mostly, and to sort of build national morale after the pandemic of 1919. And that's actually really helpful for Eisenhower because he recognizes that the country needs to be more tightly bound together, and because he sees a lot of the country that otherwise he wouldn't see. But one of the things that's interesting about that tank convoy is that it never manages to go above 10 miles an hour on the entire way across the country. Obviously, it goes faster, some places slower than others, but bridges break, and there aren't roads, and there are dirt roads, and whatever. And that's going to come back in for a repeat in a few minutes. But what happens is that after World War I, the Army sends Eisenhower to Panama as an aide to a guy named General Fox Connor. And Connor recognizes just how brilliant Eisenhower is, and he kind of takes him on as an intellectual project. So they study tactics, they study art, they study history. He really tries to design him to be ready to take on another world war, which Connor believes, is going to happen. So he's got this sort of military finishing school, And then after working with Connor, Connor arranged for Eisenhower to go to the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth, where he actually graduates first in his class. He's an exceedingly well-trained person, but he's trained not only in military tactics and in mathematics and all the things you need to know in order to be a military leader. He's deeply trained in history and philosophy and the softer sciences, if you will, of human nature. And that's going to matter a lot in just a minute. So what happens is that he becomes, in 42, he becomes the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces. I bet I've said that about 5 times now. And in 43, he becomes the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. And now, of course, as I was talking about, right before 52, he's like, I'm going to have to challenge Taft for the presidency, for the Republican nomination in 52. And the reason for that is, having done all this studying of human nature, Eisenhower is terrified by what he has seen during World War II. So what really hit home for him was when U.S. soldiers liberated a concentration camp called Ohrdruf, which is right near, which is the funneling camp into Buchenwald, and they liberated in 1945. And Eisenhower is nearby, and the soldiers are horrified at what they see. I mean, there are piles of bodies that are still smoldering because the Nazi guards tried to set them on fire to destroy the evidence. And there are people men who were so starved they literally couldn't move. And the camp stank so badly that one of the European generals tries to go in, and I'll explain why in a minute, and he can't. He just stays outside the camp vomiting. I mean, it's truly hell. And Eisenhower goes a week later, and he was shocked beyond belief, because this is a man who's seen war for sure, and he's certainly heard the stories about World War I. But he writes home, and he writes to his wife, and he says, I never dreamed that such cruelty, bestiality, and savagery could really exist in the world. And this really changes his concept of how to move forward, because he says human beings will turn into animals against each other. And we have a huge problem after 1945, because now we have the invention of the atomic weapon, which literally can destroy the world. So he thinks through this, and he says, we must prevent the rise of the extremism that is going to enable somebody to turn their people toward nuclear savagery. And so what he does is he turns to a number of places, but one of the philosophers he turns to is the guy you hear me talking about so much, and it's actually Eisenhower got me onto him, a guy named Eric Hoffer, who in 1951 writes a book called True Believers, in which he tries to explain how you get the conditions to make it possible for a dictator to rise. Because, you know, everybody's wondering in 51, how do we get Hitler? How do we get Mussolini? And Hoffer says, who cares? There are dictators in every generation. What you need to know about is not how you form a dictator, but rather how you form a group of people who are willing to follow a dictator, because that makes the difference between whether somebody is going to turn to a dictator or not. So don't worry about Hitler and Mussolini. Worry about the people who supported Hitler and Mussolini. And what Hoffer said really resonated with Eisenhower, to the point that he used to give away copies of his books. Because what Hoffer said is that if a population is destabilized, that is either economically or culturally or religiously, they come to believe that they are not as important as they used to be, that their lives are not as stable as they used to be, they are ripe for people to come in, for leaders to come in and say to them, I can take you back to where you used to be. The problem is not the world. It's not economics, it's not the environment, it's not any of these things. The problem is those people. And who those people are doesn't matter, so long as they have someone to hate. And Eisenhower, and then Hoffer goes along in a great deal more about how that plays out. And by the way, that's really the starting point for the book I just published, looking through the stages of the rise of oligarchy, how you dehumanize a group of people at the same time you convinced your followers that you belong on the top. And I'm not going to go more into Hoffer now, but Eisenhower picked up from Hoffer the idea that the one thing that mattered to create stability in the world after World War II was to guarantee all peoples a rising standard of living. That is, so long as you could guarantee that people's lives were getting better, it would stop the rise of political extremists either on the right with fascism or on the left with communism, and it would also stop the rise of religious fanatics. And he was very concerned about the rise of religious zealots who might decide that they were following their true leader and they had to take control of the world, again, through nuclear weapons. He's very concerned about nuclear weapons. And I mean, he's right. I mean, that's the thing. This argument really stood the test of time, if you think about it. However, so this is why he cares so deeply about NATO. This is why he's going to do what other Republicans call stomach diplomacy. Try and make sure that America is spreading aid and basic humanitarian support across the world. Not necessarily out of the goodness of their hearts, although I'm sure people were moral, but rather that by guaranteeing that people around the world had a rising standard of living, it would undercut the possibility that those communities would be welcoming to a dictator who promised them power, promised to return them to their former security in exchange for extraordinary power that he could then use to launch nuclear weapons. So that's what Eisenhower is all about. And when he goes on to believe that the real future of the world is ideological, that wars are going to be fought ideologically in the future, not on the ground. And he is terrified when Taft says, screw NATO. I mean, sorry, forget NATO. I don't care about NATO. Let's just let whatever happens, because he's terrified that if that's the case, it is entirely likely that the entire globe is going to be destroyed by nuclear war. All right, so what happens then is that people have been trying to get him to run for the presidency since '48, and he's like, I have no interest in this. And what he does actually is he goes to the president of Colombia, which, you know, people say now, oh, he's a terrible president, whatever. He goes to the presidency of Colombia because he believes that's where he can bring the best minds together to address the problems of the post-World War II world. I mean, it's a really interesting decision, if you will, and not everybody loves what he does at Columbia, but what he is trying to do is actually create sort of a business / academic / government think tank to try and guarantee that America is going to be able to lead the world out of a situation where there could be nuclear war. So what happens then is that when Taft says he's not going to support NATO, Eisenhower is like, okay, I'm gonna go ahead and give a run for the 1952 Republican convention, and this absolutely infuriates the Taft Republicans, because in fact Taft almost has sewn up the number of people he needs in order to gain the 1952 nomination, and they really just think that he's going to walk into it. But what happens is that Taft has about 530 of the votes he needs. He needs 630 primary votes, and he just thinks he's going to win the nomination. But Eisenhower comes out of left field, runs for the nomination, and in the convention itself, they actually have fist fights over this. And by the way, if you're interested, you can go on YouTube and you can see video of the 1952 Republican convention, which, by the way, generally is boring as dirt. I mean, it's just a bunch of guys in white shirts and black pants and hats talking. I mean, seriously, it's like watching grass grow. But there's some wonderful moments where the leaders of the convention want to patch up the differences between Eisenhower and Taft. And so they actually put them on a couch to pretend that they're friends together. And the body language is just to die for, because Taft is like, and Eisenhower's like, and it might be, if you're interested, it's kind of fun to go look at. Plus, if you're really bored, there's totally cheesy like GOP props at the 52 convention, because they don't yet know how to manipulate the media. That's going to come in a few minutes. All right, so what happens though, the way that he gets the nomination is that the Massachusetts delegation which is led by Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. You know, I've talked so much about Henry Cabot Lodge Sr. He's led by Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. They switched the Massachusetts delegates' votes to Eisenhower. And when that happens, Eisenhower gets the support. He also gets the support of Dewey Republicans from New York. So you've got New York and Massachusetts who have switched the Republican nomination from Taft to Eisenhower. And that is where we get the idea of the Eastern establishment that is standing against people like Taft. That's the Republicans in Massachusetts and New York who turned the convention to Eisenhower instead of Taft. And totally aside here, this is one of the things that opens up the way. There's people, the Massachusetts Republicans are so angry and so split that this is one of the reasons that John F. Kennedy is going to be elected as a senator from Massachusetts, is because of that split in the Republican Party. They kind of leave the way open for a Massachusetts Democrat in coming up. All right, so Eisenhower's got the nomination. The Taft guys are furious. They are furious beyond belief. Like I say, there's a fist fight at the convention, and the Taft people are like, I mean, there aren't enough expletives to tell you how angry they are about this. But so what happens then is that Eisenhower goes on the road. And this is important because in 1952, it's really the Eisenhower campaign that's going to run the first modern media presidential campaign. So I just told you that the 52 convention is boring as dirt. And believe me, that's putting a positive spin on it. It's totally boring. I mean, seriously, it's just guys standing around talking, which probably is all a convention is at the time. But all the good stuff you don't hear about. But with the campaign itself, Eisenhower's campaign recognizes that they can use the new medium of television and the new idea of the things like cars that are available after World War II to make Eisenhower constantly look like a returning hero. So they throw him ticker tape parades all over the place where they have advanced men who go out and they actually give ticker tape and confetti in boxes to people to throw when Eisenhower comes through. They have crowds, they arrange to have crowds surging around him. So he constantly sort of reconjures up the idea of the victory of World War II. And they do that really deliberately and extremely effectively. He also, for the first time, and of course people were thrilled to see Eisenhower. And for the first time, both candidates traveled by airline as well. Eisenhower traveled about 30,000 air miles during that campaign, and only about 20,000 by train, which was more traditional. The Democratic candidate, also Adlai Stevenson, also used an airplane for this. And what it does is it really includes the people a lot more than it has in the past. Similarly, they use television. Eisenhower's people are going to deliberately stage television audiences and to feature Hollywood entertainers at campaign events, trying to draw in people through the medium of television. One of my favorite stories about that is that a guy in Los Angeles almost kills Eisenhower when he gets his packet of confetti to throw for Eisenhower, but he doesn't understand he's supposed to open the box and throw the confetti. So he throws the box at Eisenhower and nearly brains him in his as the open car goes by. But so Eisenhower, in order to and the Republicans, in order to calm the Taft wing, tap as Eisenhower's running mate a young California congressman who's been close to McCarthy, a guy named Richard Milhous Nixon. And they are able to use television to package Nixon as well, because Nixon from the start is sleazy, basically. And he's got what is essentially a slush fund, which is, his donors put up a fund for him that he is able to use however he wants. And it's about $18,000, which is a lot of money. And Eisenhower, this called the fund crisis. The fund crisis erupts, and Eisenhower's appalled. He doesn't like Nixon anyway, and he thinks about dropping him from the ticket, and Nixon's never going to forgive him for that. Nixon never forgets a grudge, and so Nixon has to go on TV and try and defend himself against the idea that he's got this slush fund, and he does. He gives a half-hour televised speech in which he says that this fund that his donors have put together to fund his nomination, his election to the Senate, is a sign of his good character, not his bad character, because it proves that he's just a regular guy. He doesn't have the money to fund his own campaign, and that he had worked in the family grocery store as a child. He had put himself through college. He and his wife Pat had worked their way up until he went into the Army. They had to save to buy a house. They had a mortgage. He said they still owed about $8,500 on their mortgage. They drove an old car. And he says, Pat doesn't have a mink coat, but she does have a respectable Republican cloth coat. And I always tell her she looks good in anything. And then he goes on to say, the only gift I've ever received is a little dog. It's a little Cocker Spaniel dog. And my 6-year-old daughter named it Checkers. And I don't care what you say about this, we're going to keep it. Well, this is a very famous Checkers speech, right? Where he basically manages to turn away the accusation that he's got a slush fund, which he did, and turn it into, I'm a good, hardworking Republican man who's worked my way up, and me and Pat are just sort of your model Americans. And a lot of people who might not have been paying attention to his anti-communist stand look at that and are like, yeah, me too, in the wake of World War II. I lived through the Depression. I worked my way up. I'm just like him. And that's going to be really powerful coming up. All right, so after the Checkers speech, Nixon has cemented his place on the ticket, and he, of course, is going to go on to become enormously influential in American and Republican history. But so what happens with this power, with this election in 52, is that Eisenhower and Nixon win, and they win with about 55% of the vote. This is not a close election. Adlai Stevenson gets about 45% of the vote. And they also win control of Congress. So Eisenhower now has the ability to create this world that he envisions, where everybody has an upwardly mobile standard of living. And he first of all believes in the sort of retrenchment that everybody believes in after a war in this period. And to accomplish that, he calls for a reduction of the national debt. He wants to balance the budget, and he's going to. He's going to be the last Republican president to balance the annual budget. Bill Clinton is going to as well. Under Bill Clinton, the budget is going to be balanced. But so a Democrat has done it since a Republican. Eisenhower is the last Republican to have done it. And he is going to hammer on low inflation. And once you've paid down the debt and once you have balanced the budget, then he wants to lower taxes. But until that, he's going to keep the war level taxes. So under Eisenhower, the top bracket of income taxes in America is 91%. So every time somebody on the far right says, we need to go back to the 1950s, my answer actually in person has often been, sure, great. Let's start with the 91% income tax bracket. And they're like, whoa, no, not that. Well, that's how he accomplished the other pieces of it. The 91% tax bracket was, of course, primarily designed to pay down the extraordinary debt that America had incurred during World War II. And one of the real problems with a debt, and that's the general package of stuff we owe rather than the deficit, which is the yearly package, the annual package. The problem with the debt, I'm actually in the team of people who thinks the national debt is a very good thing, generally. But the problem with a large national debt is that you pay so much money to servicing the debts, to paying interest on it. And there comes a point when you're paying so much in interest on the debt that your tax money basically isn't going anywhere. And this is one of the things that Eisenhower is trying to get away from, simply throwing money at an existing debt. So at the same time that he's looking at fiscal conservatism, he is also looking at the right of workers to bargain collectively. He supports that. And he also believes that they need to have decent wages because, as he said, everybody, we all, workers and farmers, foremen and financiers, technicians and builders, all must produce more, and produce yet more, because only that production could produce world stability, which is what he's looking at. So he also does a number of things. He wants to expand social services to protect people against acts of God or whatever, to create a social safety net, but to strengthen it from what the Democrats had, and to try and address issues of healthcare and housing as well. This again expands on what FDR had done, and he calls his new expansion of this vision a middle way. He calls it the middle way between untrammeled freedom of the individual and the demands of the welfare of the whole nation. In this spirit, he says, we must live and labor, confident of our strength, compassion in our heart, clear in our mind. And the philosophy that underpinned his modern republicanism, one of his supporters wrote in a book, was, quote, if a job has to be done to meet the needs of the people and no one else can do it, then it is the proper function of the federal government. And that is almost exactly a direct quote from a fragment that Lincoln left behind, by the way. So Eisenhower is really deliberately pulling up Lincoln. So how does he do this? So first of all, Eisenhower tries to put his vision into place. And the first place he tries to do it is in international affairs. And this was a real surprise to me. Shortly after he takes office in January. And then in March of 1953, Stalin dies, and that makes Eisenhower think he can reboot, if you will, well, there's not a word then, rebooting, but reset, if you will, the relationship between the U.S. and the USSR. And he wants to stop the investment in Cold War munitions because he says it's a waste of money. He says even if both nations manage to avoid an atomic war, pouring all of their wealth and energy into creating armaments is going to destroy their ability to fix the world. So he said, and this is a great speech, he's actually sick when he gives it. He's in terrible pain. He considers it so important. He goes to this press, it's not a press conference, it's a meeting of the press, to give the speech. And he says, every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who are hungry and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. He goes on to say that the sweat of workers, the genius of scientists, and the hopes of children would be far better served if America spent, and the USSR spent its money on schools, hospitals, roads, and homes rather than on munitions. He says world peace can be achieved, quote, not by weapons of war, but by wheat and by cotton, by milk and by wool, by meat and by timber and by rice. And it just blows my mind that this is a Republican speaking. I remember during the 70s, I saw this quotation on a poster, and by the 70s, I truly believed it was a Democrat who said it. It's a Republican. That's a quote from Eisenhower. So he tries, first of all, to stop totalitarianism. Stop that word I can't say. Stop totalitarianism from rising overseas. And he has to negotiate a lot of things, including what's happening in what is at the time known as Indochina. That's Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. He says there's no way America should go in there. It's a swamp. America's never going to win. And he's trying to negotiate all these different places, trying to push back against communism militarily, largely through advisors, but also through humanitarian aid. And he because he saw everything through a mix of this desire to stop the rise of communism as well as fascism, his legacy on overseas is really mixed. And I've talked about, just mentioned Iran. Of course, he's going to overthrow a popular leader in Iran with the idea that we need to install a pro-capitalist leader there, and that's going to create complete havoc in Iran that we are still paying for today. And that's his biggest black mark right there. He also goes ahead and negotiates a peace of sorts in Korea, and again tries to make sure across the world that he is stopping the idea of the potential for destabilization of populations that are going to make them turn to dictators. But at home he also tries to put his vision into place. So the first thing he does is he as I say, works on overhauling the financial system to go ahead and make sure that we can pay off our debts. But at the same time, he goes ahead and tries to develop business. So he goes ahead and pulls back the regulations that FDR has put in place. He cuts drilling regulations along the coast, for example, turns those rights over to the coast, over to the states on the coast. And increasingly, even though he's talking to businessmen, he's getting more and more frustrated with them because he says, private persons have been seeking to further their own interest by highly questionable activities in legislation, for example. These I deem so arrogant and so much in defiance of acceptable standards of propriety as to risk creating doubt about the integrity of government processes. At the same time, he asks Congress to go ahead and shore up ordinary Americans, the workers. He asks Congress to create a Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which is where we get that. He also tries to get the government to expand social welfare benefits. So he expands Social Security, covering about 10 million people who weren't covered before. And he also names Nelson Rockefeller, who is a New York politician in the mold of Dewey, of Thomas Dewey, and who is actually the grandson of Nelson Aldrich and John D. Rockefeller. I think I mentioned that their son and daughter married each other. And he was actually born in Bar Harbor, Maine. But anyway, he names Nelson Rockefeller to be the undersecretary of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And he tells Rockefeller to go ahead and create a national health care system. It's Eisenhower who first says we need a national health care system. Rockefeller does it, doesn't get through Congress. And it doesn't get through Congress in part because of the Taft Republicans, but also in part because of the Southern Democrats who don't want any desegregation in things like housing and health care. Eisenhower also wants federal aid for depressed areas, industrial areas. He wants to federally fund the schools, and he wants federally funded highways. So the aid to depressed areas and the aid to schools fail again on the issues of segregation, but the federal aid to highways, in fact, passes. And until the latest coronavirus bills, the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 was the biggest stimulus package in American history. It put about $25 billion initially into place to create 41,000 miles of highway across the country over 10 years to get rid of the problem that he had run into with the tank corps, that you couldn't cross the country. And this jumpstarts the economy by providing new jobs for the people coming out of World War II and in the 1950s, and ties together the states and creates new diners and new motels and new gas stations. And people move away from the original road that was across the country, Route 66, get your kicks on Route 66, and they start to use the new Eisenhower interstate highway system. And it works. Eisenhower's middle way works. Between 1945 and 1960, the gross national product in America grew from $200 billion to $500 billion. Now, this is in part because Europe is buying so much to rebuild after the war, but it's also a jump of 250%, suggesting that this system works incredibly well. And this is going to matter because, again, in a bit, you're going to hear people from the Taft wing of the Republican Party talking about how he is destroying America. And they're talking about that in a period when American prosperity is the best it has ever been. And it's a really interesting divorce there between image and reality. But that new prosperity is incredibly widely shared because of that GI Bill I talked about last week. You had people moving into this expanding middle class, buying cars, buying new houses, having babies, who need bikes and who need lunch pails, lunch boxes, and who are going to new schools. And as the middle class moves up and moves into this real prosperity compared even to the standards of 1920, but certainly compared to 1930 and the 1940s, as that happens, as I say, they create a suck that enables people at the very bottom to move up into unionized industrial jobs, for example, to move up into better paying unskilled work as well. So the economy as a whole kind of moves up and creates this extraordinary prosperity. And it's important to remember, of course, that this is not universal. People of color do not share in this in the same way, not just African Americans, but also, of course, indigenous people and Mexicans and Mexican Americans, Chinese, Asians, Japanese, They're not going to share in this prosperity, but it is an image of prosperity that is really widely spread across the country. The image is widely spread. And the idea that this sort of prosperity is within reach because the government is trying to make it come into reach for everybody. And I'm going to talk more about what Eisenhower is trying to do in 54, 55, 56, 57 to try and make this prosperity reach into previously underserved populations. But there is this image in the 1950s that not only Eisenhower, but also Eisenhower and the Democrats under FDR and later under Truman have created a new consensus that is going to reign for the rest of American history, that has created universal prosperity and has created this world where people can get out in their brand new candy-colored cars, see America, and have happy, healthy, prosperous family lives. And that image is one that fascinates me in 1954. 1955, 1956, because of course that's the very image that the Taft wing of the Republican Party is going to take on and call a destruction of American values. And I will do that next week. I hope that was of interest. And I am sorry I get excited by this stuff. And I will see y'all Tuesday if you would like, if you want to do history and politics chat. And otherwise, Thursday, 1 o'clock, when we will get into the growing power of the Taft wing of the Republican Party to destroy that liberal consensus. Thanks a lot for coming.